Good evening, everyone. Happy Tuesday. It's lovely to see you all. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the JUFJ Heschel Experience session on the impact of the 2020 elections. My name is Jacob Feinspan. I'm the Executive Director of Jews United for Justice, and I use he and him pronouns. And I'm really thrilled to see so many of you here this evening for the first of our two sessions tonight. We are in for a treat because we have three of the smartest campaigners and political strategists in the region here with us tonight. Hopefully we'll not have any guest appearances by my children. They are also strategic, just in different kinds of ways. Tonight's program is like the middle program of the Heschel Vision Experience, 3 nights of learning, action, and celebration. And I hope you'll be back for some of the great offerings on Thursday night too. I want to encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. There are so many friends here with us. And this is the technical and Zoom piece of things. In order to have the best viewing experience, I want to recommend that you click on the 3 buttons on the top right of your screen and choose the speaker view. And to know that we are recording tonight's program so that we can share it with those who can't be here tonight. And if you don't want to be included in that, you can just turn your camera off and you won't be recorded. And then lastly, if you have any technical challenges, you can just use the chat function to message to tech support, and there are folks standing by to help you. So it's now my honor to introduce our 3 speakers for the evening. First, Wendy Chun-Hoon, who is the Director of Family Values at Work, which is transforming work in our country by influencing national policy and supporting a network of 27 state campaigns for paid family and medical leave and paid sick days. She also knows this region well. She was a crucial partner in the campaign for DC's paid family leave program, which we won almost exactly 4 years ago and launched this summer, and is a Tacoma Park resident and also is a former chief of staff for Maryland's Welfare and Child Welfare Agency. So our second speaker is Elizabeth Falcon, the executive director of DC Jobs with Justice, which is an amazing coalition of labor organizations, community groups, faith-based organizations, and student groups dedicated to protecting and advancing the rights of working people in DC. And she has played a leading role in campaigns for social change in DC for more than a decade before coming to Jobs with Justice. She led the Housing for All campaign that demanded and won ongoing commitments of $100 million a year for DC's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And then last but not least, Kim Propeack, who for the past 2 decades has played a leading role in organizing campaigns for immigrant rights at CASA, which builds power and improves the quality of life for Latino and immigrant people in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. She now serves as Chief of Politics and Communications at CASA and is also a central leader of CASA's sister organization, CASA in Action, which has played a crucial role in transforming the political landscape in our region. I'll also say before we get started that in addition to being 3 of the most brilliant political strategists in our region, Kim, Elizabeth, and Wendy are also 3 of my favorite people in this region. So it's a particular joy to get to lead this conversation tonight. So let's jump into it. And Kim, I'm going to start with you. What were some of the really big outcomes of this election in Maryland?
So I think I have to start by, well, first of all, good evening. I saw many of you on the screen also on Sunday's gala, and I really, really appreciate and want to hold up what an extraordinary partner JUFJ is for our members. CASA is a grassroots organization. Our members are directly impacted folks who have democratic decision-making power in our organization, and JUFJ has been an extraordinary partner on everything from our sort of core immigration issues to policing reform, which is also critical for our members, to, you know, always important housing, but now in the context of COVID, like an unusual opportunity, I think, to make gains for tenants in this politics. I should preface this by saying that CASA spent most of our time in 2020 actually in Pennsylvania and Virginia, two other states where we have thousands and thousands of members. I'm sure you all appreciate that we were focused there. I know Virginia is not very, it's not top of everyone's list, but we were happy to play our part in Pennsylvania in getting rid of the tyrant in the White House. Mostly we were watching a little bit after the primaries in Maryland from afar, all the great work in Maryland. And I think in light of the primaries, in terms of Maryland, I think the first thing we have to talk about is obviously the enormous shift in power in Baltimore City, and the opportunity. We have perhaps the most progressive mayor in my lifetime, now leading the city. We got involved in three councilmanic races, where we think we both shifted power that for decades had been held by white legislators to women of color, and also by happenstance also elected the first Latina in history to the Baltimore City Council. And we have a great president, really very, very progressive president. So, I think that Baltimore City, I know there's lots of folks from the Baltimore City JUFJ support leadership group on the call. I feel like has really underpunched its weight class. It is, if not the largest jurisdiction at this point in Maryland, probably the most meaningful jurisdiction in terms of the history of the state, the history of Maryland, what people hold dear, and people watch Baltimore. It has been disappointing to see other jurisdictions in the state jump ahead of the city on issues like Record 15 because of the prominent leadership that we've had in the city. And so I think that 2020 has really created not only a new political future for I just looked at the numbers, more than 12,000 members of Baltimore City, but also the state. Because if Baltimore can't get a minimum wage increase done, how can we expect, the purple Frederick County legislators to vote for it in Annapolis? Obviously, that's a foregone conclusion at this point. I think another thing that we learned in Maryland in this election cycle was that with actual effort and investment, that we actually can win, what have historically been very, very tough voter referenda. Everybody knows Maryland is not a great place to put something on the ballot. It's very difficult to do. So a lot of the more pernicious ballot referendum activity does happen on a county level. Montgomery County, we have suffered for years with these series of Ficker amendments, who I think probably everybody knows is a sort of political gadfly who, is successful in getting on the ballot, trim-related ballot initiatives. This year in Montgomery County, we're also in the middle, like Howard and several other jurisdictions in the state, in the middle of a pretty significant reshaping of our school boundaries in a way that has really lifted up a lot of very toxic voices. In Montgomery County, who have always been there, right? But there's nothing like a school boundary study to really put those folks on the map. And so we had some pretty toxic ballot initiatives. I think this is, I've been around a lot of ballot initiatives in Montgomery County. I want to be clear, we didn't do much on this other than write a check. But thankfully, under JUFJ's leadership, JUFJ really led both tables on both of these campaigns. We were able to both defeat the amendment that was really designed to give smaller single-member councilmanic districts to the purpose of it was really to give like Clarksburg and sort of the seat of all of these ruminations on school border studies a seat at the individualized seat at the table, and to make trim a permanent part of our lives. In the same way, for those of us that are in Prince George's County always complain. So that's kudos to JUFJ.
Kim, can you just, for those of us that don't follow Maryland politics as closely, describe trim and what that means for folks?
Sure. So trim is really about whether or not we believe that there should be public investment in public goods. Trim outlaws the capacity of, I mean, it takes a lot of different formats, but generally speaking, outlaws the capacity of a council or executive to raise property tax limits in light of economic conditions or to fund different priorities. And we already have a pretty tough requirement in Montgomery County, which is that you need a unanimous vote of the council to overcome the limits on property taxes. It would make this, if question B had passed, it would have made it impossible even through unanimous vote to raise the tax limits. And you know, these are really, I mean, it's like a very specific thing. Obviously, trim sounds for a lot of tax, but it's been a very difficult issue to message around historically in all of its jurisdictions. We were involved in a campaign several years ago under the Baker administration to try and repeal a very tough trim guideline in Prince George's County. But really what it comes to in Montgomery County, in the Montgomery County context, I mean, we like to think of like New Montgomery County, right, which is like super embracing, but like there have been pretty recent wars in the county about what the new county looks like and who the services are going to, and who's filling the schools. And trim is just sort of like a mind meld for taxpayers and residents in the county who have those tax concerns. But the extraordinary news is, like, I don't know this because I haven't looked around the country, but probably you guys did in your research. Thanks to JUFJ leadership, this has got to be one of the few times in history that trim failed at the ballot box. And so again, I just really want to say I'm a Montgomery County resident. I don't always say that with pride, but I do now, and it really is thanks to JUFJ's work. I think just before, I know we have to move on, but just before we do, I do want to say that this is not about the 2020 election, but anything we're doing from now to eternity is really about the 2022 elections in Maryland. And I think that everyone who does work in the Maryland legislature knows that we had extraordinary leadership shifts in the General Assembly. And unfortunately, though, many of those leaders took place during an enormously chaotic moment. And many of us had lots of complaints about the failure of the General Assembly to return to special session. But we also lost a whole a bunch of leaders were not tested. New leaders were not tested in the Maryland General Assembly when we shut down due to COVID in the spring. So this session coming up is going to be, I think, their first real session to actually fulfill the commitments they've made, and on the eve of primaries in Maryland. And so anything now, maybe even for the past year, but certainly from here forward, is really about 2022. You know, I say with my C4 cap on, you know, recovering from the Hogan years, and making sure that the state really fulfills the progressive promise that it makes.
Thanks so much, Kim. Elizabeth, I want to shift to you and ask, because there's some pretty significant shifts on the DC Council this election cycle, in part opened up by Councilmember Jack Evans being forced off the council in shame. And thank you, Kim. So my question is, how does the election shift the balance of power on the council?
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And I'm really excited to be here with everybody. I'm very flattered to be on this panel with these amazing panelists. So, you know, DC Jobs with Justice doesn't do campaign endorsements, but obviously the makeup of the decision makers that we are targeting, of the council, and who the decision makers are that we're targeting at any given point is really important to us. And I think that there has been much disappointment about this hope that we would be able to add, that the city would add kind of Janice Lewis-George and Ed Lazier as kind of like a left flank, and really like solidify this sense of there being kind of like a left core and a cohort. There's kind of a loose cohort right now, but it's not really like cohesive, and so I understand that. But when I was zooming back to think about what happened just over the course of all of 2020 and not just in the last couple of weeks, realizing that while we didn't have this like pull to the left, we had a cutting off of the right. And so that does still shift the center of gravity, but I think, you know, because of the way that this kind of rolled out through Jack Evans' resignation and through the primary, we haven't really internalized what it means to no longer have Jack Evans and Brandon Todd on the council. And that is going to be hugely impactful. It means that a lot more votes are going to be possibly in play when we are thinking about progressive legislation, whether or not that's housing or taxation or anything else. People that we basically were like, you know, Brandon Todd was my council member and I never asked him for anything because I didn't think he would deliver, essentially ever. And so that is going to be a game changer just for us to have really a full council that we can engage on our issues.
And so you spoke a little bit about some of the about Janice Lewis George, but can you share anything about Brooke Pinto and Christina Henderson, the other two new council members who were elected, who folks may not have had a chance to get to know very well yet? Yeah.
So I feel like I am as in the dark with Christina Henderson as everybody else. Although I spent a lot of time targeting the council, I don't have deep working relationships with council staff, which is where I think a lot of folks would have gotten to know her more. I think Brooke Pinto has been a very interesting addition to the council as somebody who was extremely not well known when she first took office. On our biggest signature campaign, the Excluded Worker campaign, she was supportive of us. It wasn't just that she voted with the majority, like when we were counting votes before we knew that we had like a full majority and that we weren't going to have to actually like individually count votes on things. We found her to be receptive, more receptive than I had anticipated. I think that there's just with both of them, it's going to be both a combination of like engagement and building both like relationships and also their understanding of the issues in real time, which I think, you know, Henderson probably, like, she comes out of the Wilson building, a lot of issues have come across her desk. But I think there's just a lot of building to be done in 2021, which is hard. You know, it's just harder in this virtual environment to do those things. It was really hard. Also, Pinto had like a very limited staff when she started. So it was also hard to like work to get avenues to her. And so yeah, I think there's just a lot to be seen, but you know, it's an optimistic direction. With Christina Henderson, you know, we know, for example, on the rent control campaign that we're running, that she is not like wholeheartedly supportive in the way that some members in the at-large race and also Councilmember George will be. But, you know, even just somebody who says like, I like this part of the platform, I don't love the whole thing, like that is, again, still very different. Like we honestly never even got something like that from Councilmember Grasso. So in that way that also elections inform us about, you know, where people are on our issues in a timely way.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So now I want to turn it to Wendy. Wendy, you are in this region, but have the benefit of leading a national organization that is working all across the country. So I wonder, you know, we've gotten to hear and read a lot about what's been happening in the presidential race around the country, but haven't gotten to hear as much about what has been happening at the state level around the country. So I'm wondering if you can share some of the big things that happened in this election from your vantage point and what we can learn from them here in the Baltimore, Washington region.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I also enjoy these spaces a lot that you've created and the community brought together. So I'm also honored. And also, you know, thanks to JUFJ for, you know, actually helping to build the community of family values at work by bringing this kind of rich discussion and the work that you're doing in this region into the network of family values at work. So I I have to say, we held a post-election debrief in kind of a casual space Thursday night. So the election, the big election, hadn't even been decided yet. And but there were enough indications. So I think people were feeling relieved, but I actually think the tone felt a lot more like there is a lot of work that we still need to do for racial justice, to hold electeds accountable to we, the people who put them in office, and to fight back against, the narratives that got traction in this election, like, is it the economy or is it COVID? And they're in opposition to each other. Or, should we move into more austerity economics, including some of our friends who are calling for that? So I think, the spirit of the network was a little more tepid, maybe, to be honest. But we did spend a good amount of time focusing on bright spots, and that got people feeling a little bit better. So I'll lean into that a little bit now. I think some of the best news from across the country and certainly the network were, places that, ran some bold agendas and won, whether they're on universal pre-K, like folks in Oregon and Colorado, or there was a brilliant campaign in Portland, Maine called People First Portland, which, was really put 5 issues on the ballot, all but one of them. And they were things like $15 minimum wage and hazard pay, and outlawing facial recognition, Green New Deal types of things. So really some bold agendas. And among them, this successful paid leave ballot, paid family medical leave ballot in Colorado, which was the first time that we took the issue to the ballot. There were a lot of folks saying, how can you take this to the ballot at a time like this in the economy? So sort of getting stuck in that moment or that narrative of the economy versus people's health and livelihoods. And it won. And so I think, a lot of the network wanted to lean into and is leaning into, you put issues that matter to us on the ballot, like wages and time to care, and they win every time. So, digging in a little bit to what Colorado might mean for the rest of the movement, are things like the support for the paid leave ballot outpaced support for the Biden tickets, outpaced support for the Hickenlooper ticket, which was one of the only Senate upsets. So, I think that's important. It really shows the power of these issues. It shows, where the pulse of voters are. And now we have the hard work, just to circle back to what I said in the beginning, now we have the hard work to actually make that, make elected officials feel accountable to the folks that put them in office. So I guess my, global takeaway is I think COVID plus the uprisings plus a lot of the hard work that all of you have done in DC and Maryland and your brothers and sisters across the country, that we've actually changed the conversation about care in this country. We have built really powerful models for a very lacking care infrastructure, and sort of for paving the way and showing the way at the state and local levels. And that, importantly, in this COVID year, it's sort of like we've broken through this thing that we could never break through before. It was the biggest conundrum about how we don't sit here and experience, lack of time to care and our right to care as a personal problem, but actually it's now 100% elevated into the realm of long overdue systemic solutions. And we've got, a White House that's saying these things are important and committing to them. And I really think it's on us to keep driving that message, that mandate, and not let up. I was really inspired. I don't know if folks have seen it. I can link it into the chat if you haven't seen it, but Cori Bush, who won Missouri District 1. This is a, single mom, Black mom, nurse. And she, in her acceptance speech, basically said, we deserve all of this. And I will, serve you in Congress by working for all of this. And I think that's exactly how we need to organize in this moment.
Thank you, Wendy. So you at the end there got a little bit to, so what do we need to make happen now? Like what's on the agenda in the coming weeks, months, and years? And I want to turn back to Elizabeth and then Kim, and then come back to you, Wendy, to ask at the levels that we're each working, like what's possible right now. So so Elizabeth, can I turn to you first and just ask like what's on tap at the DC Council, and what do we need to do to make it actually happen?
Yeah, so I think 2021, right? So DC works in these 2-year legislative sessions, and one will start in January. And I think there's just like a lot of unfulfilled work that didn't happen, that like where 2020 was the moment, but just like operationalizing legislation in the pandemic was really hard. And so I think like one of the biggest pieces of that, of course, is policing, the police budget, the MPD contract, like union contract is up. And there's, I think DSA and the Movement for Black Lives just went live with a click-through letter yesterday to start opening up a public conversation about what agreements we make around police protection, the protection of the individual officers. And so I think kind of that whole policing conversation is going to continue. As Wendy mentioned, we are in a huge gray area about if we are going to be facing significant austerity. I think that's really a question about like what happens at the federal level, both like who is in Congress and what they then do with it. If we are in, like if we're going into austerity and going into cuts, I think the questions of what the priorities are upon which a budget is balanced in the middle of a pandemic is going to be very complicated and very hard fought. There are more people with more needs and more institutions with more needs, right? Like in many years, landlords and small business owners would have virtually no sympathy from me. Maybe not small business owners, but like as, you know, as a broad category. And the reality is that like we have done the right thing by not telling people they have to pay rent. At some point that is going to come to a head, and either the federal government is going to be part of that solution or it's not. And if it's not, then like all of these questions are going to be happening at local levels here and everywhere else. And then I think that another shoe could fall, right, that is related to public employees who have been able to maintain their jobs and where there's been like attrition and stuff like that. But it's only, we've just started to see it with Metro, where they're starting to do buyouts for senior, that's their plan, is to buy out senior employees. And, you know, if DC isn't able to offer a full slate of services to the public, are they going to start cutting those jobs? And what is that going to mean? Public sector jobs are disproportionately employ Black folks and women. And so whenever we're talking about public sector cuts, that's what we're talking about. And then the last thing I'll say, we run the Reclaim Rent Control campaign. Jews United for Justice is a member. We got a hearing on an omnibus bill that would have wide-ranging protections and improvements and expansion for DC tenants. That bill is not going to pass this year. So reintroduction, and I think it's one of those bills that I think, like paid family leave, is going to be a long slog. It's going to be the kind of bill where every component of it is debated and questioned, and who pays for it, and the trade-offs are going to be like deeply interrogated in a not particularly helpful way, because the bottom line, kind of like paid family leave, is like mostly Black people and immigrants are getting displaced from DC at extremely high rates. We have the fastest whitening zip codes in the country. We have done almost nothing to bring the private market into the conversation and regulate the private market in order to prevent that from happening. Rent control is the way to do it. And we are going to need to do I will just say we need to do everything that's on the platform in order to have the best possible outcome to end that displacement. I think we made rent control an issue on the ballot, or not on the ballot, sorry, like in the election. It was, the press understands it, the candidates understand it. And so next year is going to be about moving that power into winning, and winning something big and comprehensive.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Kim, can I turn to you and ask, what's the agenda in Maryland in the coming year? I mean, there's also, like, you mentioned a little bit about Baltimore City and Baltimore County, but I'm thinking, and Montgomery County, but I'm thinking particularly at the state level, because we're about to enter that 3-month sprint, and would love your insights before we get there.
Sure. Well, of course, it may stop at any moment. The entire plan for the session is like how to stop it in some ways. But so I mean, I think there's nothing like new about what I'm going to say. Obviously, we have some veto overrides to do right away. And the HBCU bill, the Kerwin bill, and for those of us who are battling on the issue of special session. Actually, can people hear me? Because I know there were some chats. Okay, great. Sorry about that.
And Kim, before you go too far, can you just spell out HBCU bill and Kerwin bill for those of us that
my apologies, of course.
Maryland
Maryland has been subject to litigation for many, many years now that the state inequitably funded its historically Black colleges and universities. And so this is a bill that would right some of that. It's part of a settlement deal in the litigation, and it would send a huge infusion of new cash into Morgan State and the other HBCUs in the state. Yes, Carol's pointing out that there are lots of bills to override. You absolutely are right. I do think the two that have consumed the most political space, though, is this HBCU override and the Kerwin override. Kerwin is sort of like, for those who are around for Thornton 3.0, it is designed to both dramatically increase the amount of funding in the public school system. And from our perspective, our focus in it was to, in addition, actually put some real legs on those requirements to make sure that the funding is really being directed into services for the most needy students in the school system. We think the mistake of the last cycle was that it did increase a lot of state funding for the public school system, but actually most school systems did not direct that to the students that needed it. Kerwin, for those of us who are battling for a special session, the difficulty of overriding the Kerwin veto in light of not knowing who the president was going to be, if there was going to be a CARES 3.0 that would be sending cash into the state, was part of the what we were negotiating against. So I think both of those overrides are pretty much a done deal, as we expected for a long time, argued for a long time. And then I think legislators have been directed both to reduce the number of bills. I think that's more real in the Senate than it is in the House, which for those of us who also work in Virginia, we're sort of used to that scarcity perspective with pieces of legislation. And most legislators are focused pretty clearly on, of course, policing reform and COVID relief. And so a lot of us or something that has actually gotten pretty far in the past. So our top priority is the Trust Act. Our argument is that it's actually passed out of the House in 2017 and stalled before in the face of toxic leadership in the Senate, and we can get it through this time. I will say, for what it's worth, we happen to be on a call with the appropriations chair today to talk about one of our new bills, which would set up a state funding for a representation of those in immigration detention. And, for what it's worth, she commiserated about, what's happening on the Hill and whether or not the chambers will ever be able to come together to pump money back into the states, but was not speaking in terms of austerity. So I thought that was welcome. But there's no question. I mean, there's lots of plans to move policing reform, which Carol has put Leah Board repeal, which is certainly a big centerpiece of it, but we have a lot more to do in Maryland. The plan is to move on that from day one in the session, as soon as we get through the veto overrides.
Thanks, Kim. And Wendy, I'm wondering if you can speak to, for years, Family Values at Work has supported state and local campaigns for paid family leave and paid sick days with huge success. There's, I think, more than 50 million people around the country that have been impacted by those victories. And I know there's been some movement to maybe we have opportunities at the federal level now. There's been some victories in the last couple of years, even in the past couple of years at the federal level. So how do you see change happening in these next few years? What are the possibilities at the congressional level? What do you see needing to happen at the local level, and what can we do to make a difference on those?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think if we're, I think we absolutely charge ahead. And I think if we don't have the Senate, we have to recalibrate what success looks like. So that's real. I think, I mean, it's very clear that the Biden-Harris administration has committed to a care economy or care issues. They've been really clear in the platform. Last weekend, I think it was, they put out on their site, on the Build Back Better site, a commitment to, that he would sign legislation if passed, really specific about paid leave, paid sick days. They've been very clear about long-term services and supports, very clear about childcare, given numbers for the spending on that. So I think that's super helpful, especially considering there were losses in the House, and with a diminished majority in the House, the backing of the White House definitely helps. And so, I think a lot of last week, coming right off the election, there was a lot of conversation about this conversation, this theme that keeps coming up here about austerity, about whose fault it is, about who we, what we're standing for and who we actually represent. And, thinking about the sort of apparent fight between moderates and progressives in the House about, what kind of values we stand for. And I think that needs to get resolved. And I think issues like paid leave, paid sick days, and especially in this moment, really help in that scenario. I mean, they are very popular. They unite the caucus, they unite the we, and they can be really critical building blocks. And so I think headed into the sunset. So at the end of this year, the emergency paid leave provisions are sunsetting. Unemployment insurance is sunsetting, or provisions already have. Really important programs that bring, money into people's pockets and into Main Street. And we ought to be raising the roof about these. We ought to be really drawing attention. We need to have a very visible moment coming, in the first couple of days of December, understanding it's a lame duck period, understanding that, there are challenges, but we need to demonstrate the will of the people. And so I think, in the near term, success looks like extending the sunsets of a lot of these programs, right? Really, and then beyond that, I think we have to, those provisions on emergency paid leave, for example, were really, really narrow. They carved out a lot of people. And so I think we need to make a big case for expanding those provisions. We are not through COVID yet. We won't be for several months, year more. And so calling attention to that, doubling down on that. And then, back to my earlier point, we have the House, we have the White House, and we need to anchor high around our values and passing legislation through the House and teeing it up for the Senate in 2022, if that's our first opportunity. So I think, federal level, that's what success would look like.
And then where do you see,
I don't know if you want.
I guess, where do you see opportunity at the state level in the next couple of years? I know that these campaigns don't happen overnight. So I imagine that that there's places that might be ready to get over the hump.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I want to hear from the people in Maryland who have been chatting in saying they're excited about Maryland being next. And so I would say, let's go there. Let's do that. um, we were looking at Minnesota, and Minnesota really needed to win their Senate back in order to go on paid leave and paid sick days, which were all teed up. That didn't happen. They did win some increased margins, but they didn't win the Senate back. So that was a place that was right at tipping point. I think Illinois has been at a tipping point for a while. But importantly, I don't know if Jacob, if you said this earlier, or if maybe Kim said this, but the success of places like DC and now like Colorado have spillover effect. And so the conversation that you've cooked up in the DC metro region, now moving into Maryland, is also having an impact in Pennsylvania, where they've had a campaign brewing for a long time, and they've built more power underneath that campaign to the point where it's now showing up in top tier priorities among sort of political talk. So I think if we keep doing that hard work, even if conditions are maybe they didn't quite get there in this election, that we keep the drumbeat going and keep fighting for equitable policy in terms of the models that we're winning, like DC did. We keep building the movement, we keep building the momentum, and that's how we're going to do it.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat as Kim is answering questions as we go. And Elizabeth, I actually want to come back to you because what Wendy was starting to talk about, some of the opportunities for exciting or slightly different kinds of campaigns. And one of the campaigns that DC Jobs of Justice played a key role in this past year was legislation to assist excluded workers. And wasn't only in DC, that was also happening around our region. And so can you share a little bit from that campaign with folks and talk about what we can learn from the effort that might impact future campaigns?
Yes, I will say we definitely won the first money for excluded workers, maybe anywhere in the country. We also won that money in the first week of April, which even just a couple months later, when I went back to look at it, really blew my mind. But to zoom out, to actually tell the story, when the pandemic first started and the shutdowns first started, we really wanted to be able to, we started just giving people information, telling them like, you don't have to pay your rent, you can apply for unemployment. But actually a lot of people can't apply for unemployment and they wouldn't get federal stimulus checks. And those people are people who are undocumented, but also people who just work in the cash economy, which could just be like a busser at a restaurant who's getting paid under the table, a day laborer, somebody who is, working under false papers, as well as people who've just gotten out of jail and so don't have any work history. And so we created this term excluded worker to describe that full slate, that full category of people, and started saying we need cash assistance. Essentially, we need something to make up for the lack of stimulus or unemployment benefits for those folks. And as I mentioned, in the first week of April, we won $5 million. That money actually came from Events DC. They were putting money into key sectors where they felt an obligation. So they gave $5 million to restaurants, $5 million to restaurant workers, $5 million to hotel workers, and $5 million to undocumented workers, recognizing that undocumented workers are the backbone of some of those other industries. And so 5 nonprofits then gave out $5 million worth of $1,000 gift cards, not gift like debit cards. So I've been working really closely with them, implementing it, and then implementing what we won next, which was a $9 million appropriation in the DC budget, which we again funded through Events DC so that we could kind of keep the same infrastructure to the extent an infrastructure had been built to then push that money out. But in that case, we actually won legislative language that describes our full slate of people who have been excluded. So it says returning citizens. I don't remember the language it uses for cash economy workers and folks who are undocumented, all are eligible under the new $9 million and will be So yeah, so it turns out it's very hard to build a new $9 million benefit program. And so also when the legislative language has been so contentious, we actually really had to fight Chairman Mendelson both to get the money and the legislative language. And after a big fight to include this expansive definition of excluded worker, he then also said, well, we're gonna fix it later. So then we had to wait a month and a half for them to come back from recess to fix it. So it's now actually, as of today, all of the language is functional. But one of the pieces of that, so I've been working with those 5 agencies, and now we've added a new one so that we're able to reach the populations. We meet at least once a week to reach the new populations. One of the things I want to mention as we have this conversation, about the region and about the country, is as we have been building the program, one of the things that has been extremely top of mind for everybody I work with, and I really love the team that's doing this from the nonprofit side also, has been like, how do we create the fewest barriers of entry for people who are eligible, given that their eligibility is premised on them being locked out of basic systems like banking and like identification and things like that. And so in the legislation that Mendelson passed, it required that you demonstrate a loss of income due to COVID. So we basically, Mary Center works in Montgomery County and DC, and they were like, well, Montgomery County, in their housing assistance program, you just have to self-attest. You just have to say, I lost money. So we're just gonna say, you have to say you lost money. And so that's been a really great way that we're able to, I feel like our win helped Montgomery County then win money, and the way that they implemented their housing assistance program then helped us build out how we run this assistance program. So that has been really awesome. And those low barrier to entry pieces have been so important. Just can we get cash back on the cards? Can people actually get the money? Stuff like that. So.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We have just a few minutes left as we get closer to the end of things. There's been a lot of chat in the chat about Biden and prosecution of the Trump administration. We're not going to cover that, I think. There's also been some chat about Georgia, and I think that we heard Wendy speaking most extensively about the importance of Georgia and what it means, makes possible. There's lots of news stories about that. I can say this is so Kim, you can recruit for CASA in Action. This is Jews United for Justice, our 501c3 nonpartisan institution. I will say that there's a great institution called New Georgia Project that has been leading the effort to register new voters in Georgia and done incredible work, and has a sister 501c4 organization that's doing a lot of incredible work. If you're looking for some place to engage, that's one. CASA in Action is another. And if you have other questions, we'd be happy to chat with you about that. But I'm wondering, Kim, if there was anything that you haven't had a chance to share from what you've been seeing or hearing that feels relevant to share before I go to some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat.
I mean, I do want to just emphasize that my apologies, I know nothing about DC, so you guys may have already figured out all of your COVID restrictions, but politicking in Maryland is going to be a very unusual experience. Their lobbyists are largely not going to be allowed into buildings. The groups will not be allowed to hold events. And so I think we have been trying across the interim to become much more adept at targeting tactics in light of these restrictions, but it's going to take a lot of creativity.
Yeah, there's been we haven't figured it out, or this isn't a thing that gets solved, though. The range of tactics that has been used from Zoom meetings to showing up at people's elected officials' houses is a wider range of tactics than I would say have been traditionally used in local advocacy. So I'm just trying to read through this is a very active chat. So just trying to keep up with everything.
Jacob, I think I know what my questions are.
Yeah, great.
The
Can you try to swiftly, succinctly answer them?
Yes. I think that if there is not a federal bail, there's a question about Dems and austerity. I think that if there is not significant amounts of federal money, then our local Democrats will have to respond with austerity. They and will respond with austerity. That's what we saw DC government do during the recession last time. Like, they will choose their own austerity, right? And so that's the part of the map that I'm thinking about. The other question that was for me was around just cause firing, because so just cause firing means that you would have to actually be given that you are bad at your job in order to be able to be fired. I do not think I don't think that that's where DC is going in 2021. Where I think we're going is significantly more labor protection in general around COVID. And one piece of that is around, it's more like job protection for COVID compliance and personal safety and company safety than it is around a more general not being able to be fired. So that's where I see things. And I really should have said more about the labor front. I do think there's a lot of labor protections that are going to be likely in the next session of the DC Council.
Yeah, I heard that there's a direct conversation happening right now about people being rehired for their positions if after long furloughs or after closings, even if a new company takes over, starting launched by the hotel industry and Unite Here Local 25, where I think it's, last I heard,
and
it was not just 95% of their employees were on furlough, which is just devastating in the region.
Yeah, and they actually have rehire provisions, but they're not rehire after, say, 18 months or 24 months, the period in which we think that hotels might be coming back. But that legislation is actually broader than that. So, but really saying, yes, we know people had to get laid off, bring them back first. And hopefully that'll pass in this session, actually.
So
jump in on the austerity thing.
Yeah, Wendy, and then Kim, if you have the final word, and I'll close this out because we're going to take a break before the next session start up.
Okay, yeah. I feel like we started seeing it as these more major COVID response packages were happening. It's not that we don't have the money, we do, it's where we choose to spend it, right? So I think every opportunity we can to call for really racial, gender, economic justice and be really explicit about it, because all the austerity messaging is that cuts are needed, right? Because we just spent so much money, and they are dog whistles, right? That's it. It's like racist politics, dog whistles. This is about, budgets are about priorities and values, and that's the messaging that we need to drive. So I think austerity economics is more of a habit that we need to break.
Yeah, I don't have much to add except to say, it's hard for me to imagine, frankly, that there won't be a federal bailout for local and state government. Republicans must be hearing from Republican governors, right? It's clearly in a lockdown, but some money will flow. I also, though, do think that in some ways the prior COVID bills really, I don't want to call it a windfall, but it pushed a lot of money into local and state governments to do really significant social innovations. Pieces that they, like the renters relief packages that was all over the region, or we didn't call them excluded workers checks, but or the direct aid to residents. That I think my perception is that gave local leaders a real taste of what it could mean to actually be there for the poor residents in their jurisdictions when they have needs. And I think it will be difficult. I think that will be an experience that we will be able to reflect back on and bring people to again and again and again. The So regardless of what happens with future flow of federal money, there's clearly a much greater comfort level at this point with multiple jurisdictions, and even, I guess, our governor, although he never got to the excluded workers part, in actually making direct aid in a way that never had been before available to residents.
Thank you so much, Kim. So I want to just first say thank you to Wendy, to Elizabeth, and to Kim for taking time this evening to join us. Elizabeth, in particular, your annual event, the I'll Be There Awards, is tomorrow evening, and we are deeply grateful for you taking time out of what I hope is a very calm last day before the event. Totally calm. I can see it in your eyes. And just want to mention a couple themes that I heard through the evening. So one of them is that like real change is possible in our region and is happening in this region, but it's not inevitable. It's only if we work hard and demand it. And that means working hard and demanding it in the months leading up to elections, and then working hard with those elected leaders that after they're elected, no matter who they are, to really push them to act. No matter how much we believe in them, we can't rely on them just to take care of it for us. We also heard a little bit about austerity, and there's going to need to be conversations about revenue and real revenue, and asking people who have relatively not suffered economically in this pandemic to think differently about taxes. That we had that fight in Montgomery County at the ballot over the last month, and that's a conversation that's going to be happening in DC. And if you wanted to learn more about that in DC, you can come to Joanna's session on Thursday about a just recovery and fair budget in DC. And I think the other thing that we heard some talk about was like the intense nuance and complexity of this work, like from how do we pass grand ideas to how do you write the form to make it the easiest possible for somebody to get access to the programs that we've worked for months or years to fight for. And that is why we're so incredibly lucky to have an incredible ecosystem of organizations and partners in this region that are working together, because none of us have the full range of knowledge or expertise or power to be able to influence and move things from all the way across. And this is just a small subsection of the incredible diverse network of partners that we're like blessed and honored to work with every day.